And joining me now are two experts who have a keen understanding for the hard work that goes into driving systemic change. Cynthia Choi is the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, a community-based civil rights organization focused on fair treatment of all immigrants. Cynthia is also a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, a national coalition addressing anti-Asian racism across the U.S. And Fatima Goss Graves is the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center that works to advance issues that are central to the lives of women and girls. Fatima is also a co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Thank you so much to you both for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful.
Good to be here.
Well, Cynthia, I just want to start with you, sort of a news of the day subject, really news of the last year. We've unfortunately seen more coverage of hate crimes against members of the AAPI community. You know, it's interesting. You see a lot in the headlines, the rise in AAPI hate crimes, but it seems to me that maybe we're just noticing them more or they're getting more coverage. Would love to hear your thoughts on that and what your organization is doing to combat this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's true that we have seen a surge in anti-Asian incidents and racism, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this isn't anything new to our community. We just had a guest speaker talk about immigration and the need for comprehensive immigration reform. In fact, discrimination and exclusion defines our experience here in the United States. And we have been deemed perpetual foreigners and threats, economic threats, public health threats. And of course, in the wake of the pandemic, it's been all of those things, including a hostile relationship with China. And so what we saw, though, is thousands of community members reporting that they were being scapegoated due to the rhetoric, anti-China rhetoric, as well as policies of the United States that really created fertile ground for the backlash. And so community members were verbally harassed and in some cases physically assaulted. But our communities were affected in other ways, too. We have disproportionate number of unemployment, COVID effects, like other communities of color. COVID really lifted the veil of inequality in our society, and this was one additional manifestation that our communities faced.
Yeah, and you make a really interesting point there on COVID lifting this veil of inequality. Fatima, I want to go to you next. We've seen the veil of inequality being lifted, whether it's in terms of race, but also in terms of gender as well. It seems like women of color have been hit disproportionately harder by the pandemic and its economic consequences. Would love to hear your thoughts on what needs to be addressed at a policy level to help close this inequality gap that we've seen really emerged since the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, it's totally true that COVID made more visible things that were longstanding. It's long been true that women dominated jobs where wages were very low, where schedules were unstable. Those jobs are now, we have a new term for them. We call them essential workers. Women made up the majority of essential workers during COVID, but our essential workers are often workers who we don't pay fairly and haven't treated fairly. So at the start of this pandemic, women were many times working on the front lines, but also engaging in caregiving at a time where our entire care infrastructure crumbled. And so what has been made visible about COVID has really been the fact that women's jobs, women's labor has been so totally undervalued, and the invisible and underpaid care work that they do has been undervalued. the opportunity that flows from that new visibility is to actually invest differently, to invest in our care economy differently, to actually ensure that people who do the work of care can be paid dignity wages, and that the mostly women who do the invisible work of care can have the stable support that they need. Because the last point I want to make is that this recession and recovery each have hit women really hard. That's been far more true for Black and Latino women who lost disproportionately jobs and then who left the workforce and stopped looking, in part because of not having care.
Right, right. And Cynthia, on that point, I mean, there's work you can do at a policy level and at the higher levels of government to address this issue of inequality. But what are some things that people in their everyday life can do to really break down, whether it's this issue of inequality, whether it's sexism or systemic racism? What can people do each and every day to ensure that they are pushing back against this issue?
Yes, so we all have a role in fighting and combating discrimination in all its forms. And but before I go into the individual acts, I do think it's important that as a society at an institutional level, that the government invests in human infrastructure that also includes policies that really get at the heart of discrimination and bias in our society. So if budgets and investments reflect the morals that we have as a society, we do need to invest in programs that address the root causes of bias and discrimination, and also provides ways that communities can come together to do that kind of community care and respond to incidents, because we have victims and survivors of different forms of violence, and we need those types of investments. So on an individual level, we are having a national discourse about racism in this country, and unfortunately a backlash to understanding our history and our longstanding history that was really founded on bias and discrimination. And I think that that's something that we need to lean into. We need to acknowledge this history in order to prevent the repeat of history, in the same way that we are understanding the legacy and impact of slavery, the impact of genocide, indigenous communities, and our immigration system. We have to understand that history in order to really get at the heart of why there's social conditioning and why our communities have been pitted against each other and divided. So that is a really important effort. And I think this type of education and summits really contribute to that dialogue and understanding.
It absolutely does. And, Fatima, the National Women's Law Center does so much great work every day. I would love you to walk us through what you're working on at the moment to really address gender inequality in our society.
Well, one of the biggest opportunities that we have right now is the human infrastructure that Cynthia talked about. We're in the midst of working to have either the most transformative investment in care, in childcare, in paid leave, in home and community-based supports, or not. And that is what is at stake in our view. Whose side were you really on when we actually had this dramatic she session and women were engaged in what amounts to a primal scream for support? But the other thing that I just want to name, and I thought about it because, Cynthia, when you're talking about survivors and violence, we are heading towards the 4th anniversary of Me Too going viral, and an anniversary of people actually bringing this issue to the forefront by telling their stories. And it is urgent that we address the problem of harassment and violence that pervades not just workplaces, but every sector. And then the final thing that I want to call to folks' attention that is definitely on our minds at the National Women's Law Center is the state of abortion access, which is squarely tied to the ability of women to truly be equal in this country. We are in yet another day where abortion has been effectively banned in Texas, and the Supreme Court will be considering this year whether or not Roe v. Wade remains the law of the land. And we're already seeing the consequences of what that would look like in the state of Texas on the ground as people are desperate for care and as it's actually extremely chaotic at the moment.
It's definitely a story I've been following as a reporter here, and it seems to change every day, or there's new updates, so we'll be paying attention to that. Cynthia, finally, I want to wrap with you. In your Twitter bio, something you wrote really stuck to me. It says, you say you are working for change in honor of your mom and daughters. How does your family guide your work?
Well, of course, the personal is the political. I mean, I'm in this work because I love my family, my daughters, and my community. And I want to build a world where we have empathy and compassion for anyone who is harmed, who is experiencing injustice. And this is the work that inspires me every day. We are really in the midst of an experiment. Can we build a multiracial democracy where each and every person is allowed to reach their fullest potential? And I can't agree with Fatima more by saying that right now, the assaults against women, and in particular poor women, are on the line. When we are denied our full rights to choose what we can do with our bodies, when we are not able to care for our families and live a dignified life, that is denying our life, liberty, and our fullest potential. And this is something that we should all care about, men, women, people of all genders.
Absolutely. Well, Cynthia Choi and Fatima Goss Graves, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today.
Thank you.